Part 3. The drive back to Mark's apartment was silent. Each of them was lost in their own thoughts, the mystery of Dimitri's disappearance weighing heavily on their minds. As they arrived and stepped into the apartment, the usual comfort of their shared space felt distant, almost foreign. Olivia, eager to distract herself from the growing unease, wandered to the corner of the living room where they had stacked a few old Soviet-era archives. They had picked up the newspapers during one of their earlier trips, part of a fascination with the abandoned, the forgotten, the history buried within the crumbling walls of the region. As she flipped through the yellowed pages, scanning articles on the area's history and old reports on strange occurrences, a particular newspaper caught her attention. The bold headline was in Cyrillic, dated 1989, with the words, "Abandoned Radio Station Resurrected, the Story of Technological Pioneers." The photo on the front page was a black and white image of an old radio station surrounded by overgrown trees and abandoned buildings. But it was the figure standing proudly beside the radio equipment that made Olivia freeze. It was Dimitri. Her breath caught in her throat. The man in the photo looked exactly like Dimitri, but the photo had been taken in 1989, over 30 years ago. He looked the same. The face, the expression, nothing had changed. "Guys, you need to see this," Olivia said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark, Eric, and Daniel walked over, looking at the old paper with growing confusion. As they all leaned in, they saw Dimitri's face staring back at them from the page. "That's him," Eric said, his voice incredulous. "How is that even possible?" Olivia's fingers trembled as she held the paper. She skimmed the article quickly, reading aloud, "Dmitry Ivanov, a brilliant radio technician, has been instrumental in the restoration of this abandoned Soviet radio station. His work has garnered widespread recognition for his unparalleled knowledge of radio frequencies and technology. His expertise in the field of radio communication has been hailed as nothing short of groundbreaking." She stopped reading, feeling the weight of the words. It was almost like they were describing someone else, someone who didn't belong to the Dimitri they knew. His knowledge of radio was impressive, but this was too much. The article praised his understanding of technology from an era long gone, painting him as a star of Soviet radio science. "Wait, let me see that," Daniel said, reaching for the paper. He scanned it quickly, his brow furrowing. This is ridiculous. If this article is from 1989, then this means..." "Then how the hell does he look the same?" Olivia interrupted, her voice trembling slightly. "How is it even possible for someone to look the same after all these years? 30 years. The room fell into a heavy silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator, but it felt distant and disconnected. The question hung in the air like a cloud. "Maybe it's a coincidence," Eric suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "There's a lot of people out there who have a passing resemblance to others." "But..." "No," Mark interjected sharply, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the newspaper. "This doesn't make sense. Dimitri, he's always been too strange, too involved in things that don't add up. First, he knew everything about our first trip, and now this? We can't ignore it." Olivia clutched the paper tightly, the words swirling in her mind. She glanced back at Dimitri's face, as young and alive as it had been when they first met him. It didn't make sense. How could he be in an article from 1989, unchanged, yet still so present in their lives today? They all sat down, the realization creeping in that they might be dealing with something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. Something that stretched back decades. "Maybe Dimitri isn't just some guy we met randomly," Daniel said slowly, breaking the silence. "Maybe he's been watching us for a long time. Maybe he's been a part of something bigger. And whatever that is, it's been going on much longer than we thought." Mark stared at the photo again, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of uncovering something massive, something that had been hiding in plain sight for years. Dimitri had known too much, and now they had proof that he was connected to events they couldn't fully understand. "Whatever is going on with him," Mark said, his voice grim, "we need to confront him. We need to know the truth. And if he's been part of this whole thing from the start, then it's time we find out why." Olivia slowly folded the newspaper, her hand lingering on Dimitri's photo for a moment longer than she had intended. There was no going back now. The pieces were starting to fit together. Too many coincidences, too many strange encounters. The answers were out there, and they were determined to find them. The group, still reeling from their discovery of the newspaper article, couldn't shake the feeling that everything was pointing toward the abandoned radio station. They had tried to make sense of the bizarre events surrounding them, but nothing seemed to fit until now. They decided to venture to the radio station, believing that it held the answers they so desperately needed. Mark, Olivia, Eric, and Daniel gathered outside the same cafe where they had met Dimitri earlier. There was an unspoken agreement among them. They couldn't trust Dimitri anymore, not after everything that had happened. But they couldn't ignore the fact that his strange behavior, combined with the article, suggested that he knew something they didn't. "There's no going back," Eric said, staring at the map on his phone. "This is where it all started." Mark nodded, his face grim. "We need to find out what's really going on." The journey to the radio station was long and uneventful, the landscape around them growing more desolate with each passing mile. The air seemed to thicken as they neared the location, and a sense of unease settled over the group. The dilapidated structure of the radio station loomed ahead, its once proud towers now rusted and covered in vines. Olivia felt a shiver run down her spine as they approached the gates, which were barely hanging on their hinges. It was as if the station had been frozen in time, abandoned for years. But the memories of the Soviet era lingered, as if something from that dark past was still present. "This place feels wrong," Daniel muttered, his voice tinged with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Mark pushed open the gate, and they cautiously entered the compound. The radio station was eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of decay and dust. Broken windows allowed glimpses of the interior, where old, outdated equipment lay abandoned, its purpose long forgotten. As they explored the building, they noticed something strange. There were no signs of recent activity, no tracks in the dust, no footprints. It was as if no one had been here in years, yet the feeling of being watched never left them. "We need to find the control room," Mark said, his voice low. "That's where it all started." They made their way through the corridors, each step echoing through the empty halls. Eventually, they found a metal door at the end of a long hallway. It was locked, but there was a small window through which they could see a faint light flickering inside. "Do you think Dimitri's here?" Olivia asked, her breath catching in her throat. "Only one way to find out," Mark replied, his fingers gripping the cold metal of the door handle. With a twist, the door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, they found an old radio console, the same kind that might have been used decades ago to transmit signals. But what caught their attention wasn't the equipment. It was the wall. The wall was covered in old Soviet-era maps, strange symbols, and what appeared to be a list of names, all crossed out except for one, Dimitri. "This is where he's been hiding," Eric whispered, his eyes wide with shock. "He's been here all along." Olivia felt a sickening feeling in her stomach. The station wasn't just abandoned. It was a place of secrets, a place that Dimitri had been connected to for far too long. They had walked right into his trap. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room filled with a low hum. It wasn't coming from the radio equipment, though. The sound was coming from somewhere deeper within the building, from somewhere far below the ground. "Do you hear that?" Daniel asked, his voice strained. "It's coming from the basement," Mark said, his eyes narrowing. "We need to go down there." Without another word, they followed the sound of the humming through the building, finally reaching a staircase that led downward into the darkness. Each step seemed to bring them closer to the unknown, to whatever strange force had brought them to this place. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a door that looked newer than the rest of the building, almost out of place. Mark tried the handle, but it was locked. There were no windows, and the sound of the hum grew louder. "Do you think Dimitri is behind this?" Olivia asked, fear creeping into her voice. "I don't know," Mark replied, "but we're about to find out." They had no choice but to break the door down. With a few well-placed strikes, the door gave way, revealing a small, dimly lit room. And inside, they found something that made their blood run cold. A large machine, old but functional, hummed softly in the center of the room. Cables snaked out from it, connecting to various parts of the station. The air felt thick with energy, as if the machine itself was alive. And standing next to it, looking at them with a strange, knowing smile, was Dmitri. "I was wondering when you'd make it here," he said softly, his voice almost too calm. The group stood frozen in shock, realizing that Dmitri had been the one orchestrating everything all along. But what was his connection to the machine? And why had he been leading them here? "Dmitri, what is this?" Mark demanded, his voice steady but laced with fury. "This," Dmitri said, gesturing to the machine, "is the key to everything. You've been part of this experiment longer than you realize." The hum of the machine grew louder, and the lights flickered again. They were no longer just pawns in Dmitri's game. They were part of something much bigger. The room grew tense as Dmitri's cryptic words settled in the air. Mark, Olivia, Eric, and Daniel had not planned to meet Dmitri here. This wasn't a rendezvous. They had tracked him down themselves, hoping he could shed light on the bizarre events they had been tangled in. They had no idea what to expect, but they sure didn't expect this. Dmitri, with his unsettling calm, had stood up after his short explanation and walked toward the small hallway leading to another room. Without a word, he disappeared behind the door, leaving the group in an uneasy silence. Minutes passed, and the sense of something being wrong grew heavier. Olivia shifted in her seat, eyeing the door. "This is off," she muttered. "We didn't come here to just get vague answers. We need something solid. We're already too deep into this." Eric, who had been quietly watching the hallway, leaned forward. "He's been weird from the start. First, he knows everything about us. Then he shows up with all this information we never asked for. It feels like he's leading us somewhere." Mark nodded slowly, his mind racing. They had tracked Dmitri down, hoping to find answers. Instead, they were left with more questions and a growing sense of unease. The man had always been strange, but now there was something far darker about him. "Something's not right," Daniel said, his voice low. "He didn't just leave to use the bathroom or grab something. We would have heard him. He's gone." "I'll go check," Mark said, his voice firm. He wasn't about to let Dmitri disappear like this, not when things were getting so strange. "Stay here." The others exchanged uneasy glances but nodded. Mark stood up and approached the hallway where Dmitri had vanished. He pushed open the door to the small room Dmitri had entered, but there was no sign of him. The room was dim, cluttered with old furniture, and the faint hum of machinery filled the air. "Dmitri?" Mark called out quietly, stepping further into the room. There was no answer. The room was empty, but there was no way out. Mark checked the windows, sealed shut. The door behind him was still wide open. He ran his hand along the walls, but there was no sign of Dmitri. The only thing that stood out was the eerie silence. He turned back toward the others. "He's not here. He's gone." Olivia and the others quickly moved to the doorway, eyes scanning the room for any sign of Dmitri. "This doesn't make sense," Olivia said. "There's no way out except for the door we came through." They all exchanged confused glances. If Dmitri had left, they would have seen him, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The air felt heavier, as if something had shifted in the room, and they were no longer alone. Daniel stepped toward the small desk in the corner and ran his fingers across it. There were no papers, no clues, just more old equipment and dust. He sighed in frustration, walking back to the others. "We need to get out of here. This place feels wrong." But before they could decide, a strange feeling washed over Mark. His eyes drifted back to the hallway. The sound of the hum from the machine was louder now, almost as if it were responding to their frustration, growing more intense, more urgent. "Wait," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look at this." He moved toward the desk where Dmitri had been standing earlier and picked up a small, folded piece of paper. It was a map, an old, worn piece of paper with markings that seemed out of place. The locations were unfamiliar, some of them marked in red, others with strange symbols they hadn't seen before. The others crowded around Mark, eyes widening as they tried to make sense of the map. Olivia shook her head. "This doesn't make sense. What is this? Why would Dmitri leave this behind?" Mark stared at the map, his mind racing. He thought back to everything they had learned from Dmitri and the strange occurrences they had experienced. "I don't know," he said slowly. "But this map, it's pointing to something, and I think we need to figure out what." "We're too deep into this now to turn back," Eric said, his voice grim. Daniel nodded in agreement. "If Dmitri was behind all this, we have to know why and where he's gone." The group stood in the eerie silence of the room, the map in Mark's hands growing warmer, as if it were somehow alive. They had tracked Dmitri down for answers, but now, in his sudden disappearance, they had more questions than ever. And the one thing they knew for sure was that whatever this was, whatever Dmitri had been a part of, it wasn't over yet. The abandoned radio station loomed ahead, its dark, decaying structure a stark contrast against the quiet, eerie landscape that surrounded it. The group moved cautiously through the crumbling hallways, their steps echoing off the cracked walls. The map in Mark's hands felt heavier with each step they took, the markings leading them to various rooms and corridors, but nothing seemed to make sense. They tried to make sense of the locations, checking every corner and piece of equipment, but it was as if the map led them in circles. There was no sign of Dmitri, no hidden clues, and nothing out of place. The air was thick with dust, the silence oppressive, only interrupted by their breathing and the occasional creak of the building settling. "This is insane," Olivia muttered, frustration rising in her voice. "We've been walking around for hours, and we haven't found anything. It's like the map is leading us in the wrong direction." Eric ran his hand along the wall, feeling the cold concrete under his fingertips. "It feels like the walls are closing in on us. We need to get out of here." Mark paused, squinting at the map. "No, we're not leaving yet. There has to be something here. We can't just give up." Daniel nodded, but his unease was palpable. The place felt wrong, and the longer they spent here, the more oppressive it became. It was as if something was watching them, something that had always been there, lurking just beyond the edges of their perception. Suddenly, without warning, the silence was shattered. The monitors that lined the walls flickered to life with a sharp buzz, casting a sickly green glow over the room. The static on the screens distorted before clearing up, revealing nothing but the cold, lifeless faces of the abandoned equipment. And then, unmistakably, a voice crackled through the speakers. "Can you hear me?" The group froze. The voice, faint and distant at first, carried a sense of urgency and familiarity that sent chills down their spines. Mark's blood ran cold. He recognized it immediately. It was the same voice they had heard all those weeks ago, the one that had come through the radio signal, the one that had been warning them. "It's Dmitri," Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. "It's his voice. It's always been him." The voice continued, now clearer, as though the speaker knew they were listening. "I know you're here. I've been waiting for you to find me. The game is almost over. You should have listened to the warnings, but now it's too late. There's no turning back." Mark stepped forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. "No, it can't be. He's been behind this all along. He's been guiding us here." Olivia grabbed his arm, her face pale. "But why? Why would he lead us into all of this? What's his goal?" The voice on the monitor crackled again, distorted by static. "You think you can stop it? You can't even understand what you're dealing with." Eric clenched his fists. "We need answers. Dmitri, where are you? What do you want from us?" The monitors flickered again, and the voice came through louder, more distorted. "You already know too much. You'll never leave. You're already part of this." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The monitors went silent once more, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. "We've been walking into his trap this whole time," Mark said, his voice low and filled with realization. "He's been controlling everything, leading us down this path on purpose. He's been watching us, waiting for us to come to him." Daniel shivered. "So what now? What happens to us? He's not just going to let us leave." "We need to figure out how to stop this," Olivia said, her voice resolute. "We can't just walk away from this anymore. We're all tangled in this now, whether we like it or not." They stood there, the oppressive silence of the station surrounding them, knowing they had reached the point of no return. They had come looking for answers. But what they had found was a nightmare far beyond anything they could have imagined. And Dmitri, the man they thought they knew, was the key to it all. His voice, his presence, his control. Whatever he had started, whatever game he had been playing, was far from over. As they turned to leave the room, they couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger was just beginning. The group moved cautiously down the narrow corridor, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated the floor. The eerie silence of the abandoned radio station hung heavily in the air, broken only by their uneasy breaths. Each turn felt more ominous than the last, the walls closing in around them with every step. As they passed through a darkened room, something caught their eye. An old monitor flickered to life, its screen distorting with static before clearing momentarily. For a split second, they thought it was just another malfunction. But then a shape appeared. A humanoid figure, tall and thin, its features barely distinguishable, seemed to materialize out of the static. The same figure they had seen before. The one that haunted their minds since their first encounter with the radio signal. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face a blur, its presence terrifying in its familiarity. The group froze. Time seemed to stretch and warp in that moment, their hearts pounding in their chests. It was as if the figure on the screen was aware of them, staring into their souls, waiting for them to react. Olivia gasped, taking a step back. That's it. That's the thing we saw before. The thing from the radio. Eric's breath quickened. What is that? Why is it here? It can't be real, can it? The figure on the screen flickered again, its image distorting, and then it seemed to move, just slightly. It wasn't a trick of the light. The figure was shifting, its limbs bending unnaturally, almost as if it were reaching out from the screen, trying to escape into the room with them. Mark's blood ran cold. This isn't just a recording. It's alive. It's not something from the past. It's here. It's with us. Daniel took a sharp breath, his voice trembling. We need to get out. Now. They didn't wait another second. Panic surged through them, and they turned, sprinting down the dark corridors toward the exit. Their hearts pounded in their chests, each step filled with the terror of knowing they weren't alone. The figure on the screen felt like it was chasing them, following their every movement, lingering in the depths of the station, waiting for the right moment to strike. The old building seemed to shift and groan around them, as if it were alive, reacting to their fear. The hallways stretched on forever, the doors and windows all blending together in a blur. The place felt like a maze with no way out, a never-ending cycle of fear. Finally, they burst through the main door, stumbling into the open air, gasping for breath. The night was cold, the quiet unnerving. They looked around, as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows, but the area remained still, empty, lifeless. They collapsed against the crumbling wall, shaking with exhaustion and fear. Their minds raced, trying to process what they had just seen, but there was no clear answer. Mark, his face pale and his hands trembling, looked at the others. What the hell was that? What was that thing? Olivia could only shake her head, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know, but it's not over. Whatever it is, it's still out there, and we haven't escaped it. Eric wiped his forehead, his face filled with dread. We need to leave this place. Whatever Dimitri is, whatever he's involved in, it's bigger than we thought. We can't stay here. Daniel nodded, his face grim. We'll figure this out. But right now, we need to get as far away from here as possible. They backed away from the building, their eyes scanning the darkness around them, as if the very air itself was alive with the possibility of something lurking just out of sight. But no matter how fast they ran, how far they went, they couldn't escape the feeling that they were still being watched, that the humanoid figure, the voice of Dimitri, the shadows of the station, would always be with them, waiting for the next move in this twisted game. And somewhere, in the depths of that abandoned radio station, Dimitri's plan was still unfolding. The sun was setting as the group made their way back into the city, their thoughts consumed by what they had witnessed. Each of them felt the weight of the night pressing on their shoulders, but there was little relief to be found. The feeling of being watched, of something just out of reach, lingered with them as they navigated the empty streets. Once back at their apartment, the group dispersed to their own corners, each needing time to process the horrors they'd encountered. Olivia, however, couldn't shake the growing sense of unease that clung to her. She sat at the small desk in her room, sorting through the papers they had gathered from the abandoned radio station. In the pile, there was a stack of old Soviet-era newspapers, clippings she had picked up from the station's wreckage, though she hadn't had the chance to look through them until now. Her fingers trembled as she sifted through the brittle pages, each one yellowed with age. Finally, one of the papers caught her eye. The headline read, "Radio Station at the Edge of Reality, Uncovered Secrets of Soviet Experiments." Olivia's heart skipped a beat as she unfolded the paper. The date at the top read 1989. It was an article about the radio station, and from the looks of it, it was written during the height of the station's operation. As she scanned through the piece, she felt an eerie sense of recognition in the words. The article spoke of a secretive radio station in the outskirts of Kiev, one that had been designed not just for broadcasting, but for something far more sinister. The Soviet government had funded the project, though the true purpose was shrouded in secrecy. According to the report, the station was established as a base for advanced research into communications, but the scope of the experiments seemed to be much darker than initially stated. There were mentions of signals that affected the mind, experiments that blurred the line between reality and something else entirely. As Olivia continued reading, she noticed that the article was surprisingly vague about the specifics of the research. But the part that caught her attention was the reference to a select group of scientists and military personnel who continued their work long after the government had ordered the shutdown of the project. These individuals, according to the article, believed the research had uncovered something extraordinary, a way to communicate with something beyond the human realm. Olivia's eyes widened. The more she read, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. This wasn't just about communication or technology. It was about control, manipulation, and something far darker. Then came the chilling part. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, official funding for the project was cut, and the radio station was abandoned. However, a faction of researchers and military personnel opposed the halt of the experiments. Believing that they were on the verge of discovering something far beyond what the government had intended, they continued their work in secrecy, moving their base of operations into the shadows. Rumors persist that some of these individuals never stopped their research and that the station remains active, waiting to be reawakened. The article didn't mention any names, except one. Dmitri. Olivia's stomach turned. There, right at the end of the article, there was a photo. A grainy, black and white picture of a man standing in front of a radio tower. She recognized him instantly. It was Dmitri, the man they had met, the one who had led them into the heart of the abandoned station. The article praised his expertise as a radio technician, describing his vast knowledge of the field. But something about his presence in the article, his association with the secret experiments, made Olivia's skin crawl. The man in the photo looked exactly the same as Dmitri did now. No aging, no change, as if time had never touched him. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest. She read the paragraph again, her mind struggling to comprehend what it all meant. Dmitri had been involved in those experiments. He had been part of the secret faction that had continued the research even after the official shutdown. But why was he still alive? How had he not aged a day? And what exactly had he been trying to accomplish? She dropped the paper, her hands shaking. The truth was more horrifying than she had imagined. Dmitri wasn't just some eccentric man with a strange obsession. He was part of something much larger, something far more dangerous. Her thoughts raced, her mind spinning with questions. Had Dmitri been manipulating them from the start? Had he known about the experiments all along, drawing them back into the fold of his twisted research? The answers, if they existed, seemed far out of reach. But one thing was certain. The radio station, the experiments, and Dmitri were all interconnected. And whatever he was hiding, it was far worse than they could have ever imagined. Olivia stood up, her eyes still fixed on the crumpled newspaper in her hands. They couldn't ignore this any longer. Dmitri had to be confronted. They had to get to the heart of whatever dark force he was involved with before it was too late. But as Olivia glanced over at Mark, Eric, and Daniel, who were sitting in the other room, she realized one terrible truth. No matter what they did, they were already in too deep. The shadows were closing in, and there was no escape. The days following their last trip to the abandoned radio station were a blur. Kiev, once a city full of mystery and intrigue, now felt suffocating. The quiet hum of their hotel room seemed more oppressive with each passing hour, like the air itself carried the weight of their discoveries. They had gone too far, learned too much, things that they weren't supposed to know. The team had met up early that morning, though none of them had actually spoken of it. The silence between them spoke volumes. It wasn't long before they realized that they had all come to the same conclusion, even if no one had explicitly said it out loud. "We can't stay here," Olivia said finally, her voice breaking the heavy silence that had lingered. She wasn't looking for confirmation. She knew they all felt the same way. Mark nodded slowly, running a hand through his hair. "We've gone too far. There's no going back now." Eric's gaze shifted toward the window, watching the people pass by. "It's not just the radio station. It's everything. Dimitri, those experiments, the voice, we're in way deeper than we ever meant to be." Daniel sighed deeply, the weight of their situation pressing down on him. "We thought we were just exploring, just looking for answers. But I don't think there are any answers left that we want to hear." They all knew it was true. Each time they uncovered more, the world they had stepped into felt darker, more twisted. What had started as curiosity about a forgotten place had spiraled into something far more sinister. Dimitri, the experiments, the eerie, distorted voice. It had all pointed to something far beyond their understanding. The longer they stayed, the more they realized that their search for answers had taken them to a place where they didn't belong. Olivia shook her head, her thoughts clearly racing. "We need to leave. If we stay any longer, who knows what might happen? We're not just digging into history. We're tangled in something that we shouldn't be. We're in danger." Mark looked at her with a hint of resignation. "You're right. I thought we were just playing explorers, but this isn't an adventure anymore. This is real, and it's dangerous." There was a long pause. It was clear they all felt the same pull to get away from the city that had now become more of a trap than a place of discovery. "Let's just get out of here," Eric finally said. "We'll figure everything else out later. We're too close to whatever this is. I don't think we should be here anymore." It didn't take long for them to decide. They gathered their things, packed their bags, and checked out of the hotel without a word. The streets of Kiev seemed different now. The city felt heavy with the knowledge they had acquired, the invisible presence of something watching them, something they weren't meant to understand. They took a cab to the airport in silence. There was no need for words. Each of them was focused on the same thought: escape. Their minds were already far from the city, already on the plane that would take them away from it all. When they reached the airport, the familiar bustle of travelers felt almost foreign to them. They moved through the terminals mechanically, barely acknowledging the crowds around them. The decision had been made. They had crossed a line, and now they were leaving. As the plane took off, soaring above the city they had come to know so well, Mark glanced out the window one last time. Kiev was shrinking in the distance, fading into the horizon. It wasn't relief he felt, not yet anyway, but the awareness that they were leaving something behind, something dangerous. "Goodbye," he whispered to himself, though he wasn't sure if it was to the city or to the haunting memories that would stay with him forever. The end. Subscribe to the channel if you want more stories.